King Solomon is an intriguing figure because the Bible makes so many claims about him.
For over 3,000 years, people have been fascinated by one of history's biggest mysteries, the legendary treasure of King Solomon.
Solomon decides to build a temple in Jerusalem.
Ancient writings say he had gold mines and was richer and wiser than any other king. This has inspired many explorers, treasure hunters, and archaeologists to search for his lost wealth. Now, in 2025, scientists have made exciting new discoveries in the dry deserts of Israel.
No one knows the exact meaning of the words Ophir and Tarshish.
They've found real evidence that the mines mentioned in the Bible might actually be real. After years of searching and many dead ends, this new proof could change how we see wealth and power in the ancient world. But what they found wasn't exactly what people thought. The truth about King Solomon's treasure is even more amazing than the old stories. The mystery of Solomon's gold. Long ago, there lived a king so rich and wise that his wealth became the stuff of legends. King Solomon ruled Israel 3,000 years ago, and according to the Bible, he was famous for three things: his wisdom, his women, and his incredible gold and wealth. The Bible tells us that King Solomon surpassed all the kings on the earth in wealth and wisdom. But here's the mystery that has bothered treasure hunters for thousands of years. Where did all that gold come from? The Bible mentions that Solomon's ships traveled to mysterious places called Ophir and Tarshish, bringing back tons of goods and even exotic animals. Once in 3 years, the navy of Tarshish brings in gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. The ancient text says. The problem is, nobody knew where these places were. Were they real locations or just made-up stories? For centuries, explorers, treasure hunters, and scientists have searched the globe, looking for Solomon's source of wealth. Some thought it was in India, others believed it was in Africa, and many wondered if it existed at all. What made this mystery even more exciting was the story of the Queen of Sheba. This powerful and beautiful queen visited Solomon, bringing him incredible gifts. She gave the king 120 talents of gold and of spices and precious stones, the Bible lists. That's about 4 tons of pure gold. But where did she get all this treasure? The mystery deepened when early Portuguese explorers in the 1500s found clues in southern Africa. They discovered ancient ruins and heard local stories about ships that came with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and took then 450 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. Could it be that Solomon's mines were in Africa all along? With this possibility in mind, people started looking at Africa with interest, and among them was a bright child who would one day make a startling discovery: the German explorer's incredible journey. In 1837, a poor German boy named Karl Mauck got a gift that would change his life forever. For his 10th birthday, he received a world atlas that showed Africa as almost completely blank. Most of the continent was unexplored territory, and young Karl dreamed of filling in those empty spaces on the map. Karl wasn't rich or famous. His father was just a carpenter. But he had something more valuable than money: determination. He spent 11 years preparing for his African adventure, teaching himself English, French, and Arabic. He studied medicine, astronomy, and geology. He even trained his body by walking 6 miles every day in all kinds of weather. When Karl finally reached Africa in 1865, he had almost no money and very basic supplies: just a compass, a hunting knife, a blanket, and a handgun. But he had read something that excited him tremendously. A Portuguese captain named Vicente Pagado had written about discovering a fortress built of stones of marvelous size among gold mines in southern Africa. The captain believed this was the palace of the Queen of Sheba. Karl's journey was incredibly dangerous. He nearly starved to death multiple times. He had to make friends with local tribes, survive animal attacks, and deal with diseases that made him weak and sick. But Karl's luck begins to change when he meets a famous British hunter named Henry Hartley. On July 27, 1867, Hartley brought Karl amazing news. While following a wounded elephant, he had discovered several pits dug into quartz rock. When Karl examined the site, he found something that made his heart race: gold. Highly pleased, I ran back to the camp to impart the good news, Karl wrote. He had discovered his first gold field, and newspapers around the world began reporting on his incredible find. But Karl knew this was just the beginning. If he was right about Solomon's mines being in Africa, there should be more than just gold. There should be ruins of a great city, and he would not leave without finding them. Discovery of ancient ruins. For 3 years after finding gold, Carl searched for something even more important: the ruins of an ancient city. Local tribes told him stories about fabulous buildings with huge stone walls, hidden somewhere in the mountains between two great rivers, the Zambezi and the Limpopo. These weren't just random stories. The descriptions matched exactly what the Portuguese captain had written about centuries earlier. Carl was convinced that somewhere in that wilderness stood the remains of the Queen of Sheba's palace, waiting to be discovered by the first European brave enough to find it. The search was incredibly difficult. Carl had to survive robberies, form alliances with tribal rulers, and endure constant hunger and exhaustion. At one point, he was even held prisoner until he could arrange for his release.
One time held prisoner in Matabele land until he came to an arrangement for his release.
But he never gave up his dream of finding Solomon's lost city. Finally, on September 5th, 1871, local Karanga tribesmen led Carl to a site that took his breath away. Rising from the African landscape were the most magnificent stone ruins anyone had ever seen south of the equator. The ruins were absolutely incredible. They consisted of 2 main parts, one built on a mountain about 400 feet high, and another on a slight rise, separated by a narrow valley. The walls were made of massive stones, fitted together without any mortar, just like the Portuguese captain had described centuries before. Carl couldn't believe his eyes. Nothing like this should have existed in Africa, at least not according to what Europeans believed at the time. The local tribesmen told him they had only lived in the area for about 40 years, and that the region had been uninhabited before that, so they were absolutely convinced that white people had once lived there. As Carl examined the structures more carefully, he noticed something that made his heart pound with excitement. The building style looked remarkably similar to descriptions of King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem from the Bible. The stones were the most telling proof, massive and fitted just like the ancient scriptures said. And the king commanded, and they brought great stones, costly stones, and huge stones to lay the foundation of the house. But the most exciting discovery was still to come. Carl found wooden beams supporting some of the stone structures, and when he examined the wood, he was convinced it was cedar, the same type of wood the Bible says was used in Solomon's temple, brought all the way from Lebanon. Had his draining, perilous journey finally yielded the results he'd been chasing since he was 11 years old? The evidence adds up. Carl was now certain he had found the Queen of Sheba's palace and the source of Solomon's gold. Everything seemed to fit together perfectly, like pieces of a giant puzzle. The ruins matched the biblical descriptions, the gold mines were nearby, and even the local name for the area, Sophala, somewhat reminded Ophir from the Bible. Carl believed the ancient Phoenicians had built the city. These were skilled builders and traders who lived in what is now Lebanon and were famous for traveling great distances. They built their structures without mortar, just like the ruins Carl had found. They also used cedar wood from Lebanon, which Carl was convinced he had found in the wooden beams. The Bible mentions that Solomon worked with Phoenician builders led by a man named Hiram to construct his famous temple. Could these same Phoenicians have traveled to Africa to build a palace for the Queen of Sheba and establish gold mining operations for King Solomon? When news of Carl's discovery reached Europe, it caused a sensation. August Petermann, editor of Germany's most respected geographical magazine, quickly published reports about the find. It is not improbable that they are identical with the Ophir of the Bible and with the places from which Solomon obtained his wealth in gold, he wrote. The discovery inspired one of the most famous adventure novels ever written. British author H. Rider Haggard used Carl's find as the basis for his book, King Solomon's Mines, which became incredibly popular around the world. Overnight, the phrase King Solomon's Mines entered popular culture, even though no one had ever used those exact words before. But while Carl's discovery made others rich and famous, he got very little reward for his amazing find. He returned to Germany hoping for a position at a natural history museum, but he lacked a university degree and struggled to find work. He ended up taking a job at a cement factory, suffering from depression and liver disease caused by his African travels. Tragically, Carl Moch died in 1875 at just 37 years old, falling from a hotel window in what may have been an accident or suicide. His incredible discovery was largely ignored by the academic world, and his writings were only published in full in 1960, nearly 100 years after his death. However, he wouldn't be remembered as the man who found King Solomon and Queen Sheba's palaces, but as a boy who mistakenly thought he'd achieved his childhood dream and died before he could know the truth. The scientists strike back. By 1900, a new generation of explorers had emerged, and they were very different from adventurers like Carl Moch. These were professional archaeologists, armed with scientific methods and modern tools. They weren't interested in stories about biblical treasures. They wanted hard evidence and facts. In 1905, a British archaeologist named David Randall McIver decided to take a careful, scientific look at Karl's Ophir, using methods that hadn't existed in Karl's time. Randall McIver began examining the pottery and other artifacts found in the ruins to determine their true age. What he discovered was shocking. The pottery and other items showed that the ruins had been built much later than Karl had thought, not 3,000 years ago during Solomon's time, but only about 700 years ago in medieval times. They are unquestionably African in every detail and belong to a period which is fixed by foreign imports as in general medieval, Randall McIver concluded. This was devastating news for anyone who believed in Karl's theory. If the ruins were only 700 years old, they couldn't possibly have been built by Phoenicians working for King Solomon. But Randall McIver had even more surprising news. Everything about the ruins, the building style, the materials used, the pottery, the tools, was completely African. There was no evidence of any foreign influence at all. In 1929, another British archaeologist named Gertrude Caton Thompson led the first all-female excavation of the ruins. She dug deeper and more carefully than anyone before her, sinking 6 trenches around the main buildings and excavating areas that previous visitors had never disturbed. Her conclusion was even more definitive than Randall McIver's. Examination of all the existing evidence gathered from every quarter still can produce not one single item that is not in accordance with the claim of a medieval date. If by indigenous we mean an origin born of the country on which they stand, then the ruins are, in my opinion, indigenous in the full sense of the term. Even Karl's proof about the cedar wood was wrong. When scientists properly analyzed the wooden beams, they discovered it wasn't cedar from Lebanon, but local African sandalwood. Karl had identified the wood by simply comparing it to his pencil, a method that seems almost comical by modern scientific standards. So everything Karl had believed about the ruins was incorrect. They weren't built by Phoenicians, they weren't 3,000 years old, and they had nothing to do with King Solomon or the Queen of Sheba. But this doesn't mean Karl's discovery was worthless. In fact, it turned out to be even more amazing than he had imagined. The true story of the ruins. The ruins that Karl Mausch had discovered are now known as Great Zimbabwe, which means Great House of Stones in the local language.
The name Zimbabwe, which means House of Stone, is derived from these imposing walls.
Far from being a disappointment, Great Zimbabwe has turned out to be one of Africa's most important archaeological sites and a UNESCO World Heritage location. Great Zimbabwe was built between the 12th and 15th centuries by ancestors of the Shona people, who still live in the area today. What started as a small farming village grew into a powerful kingdom with more than 10,000 residents at its peak. The people of Great Zimbabwe became incredibly wealthy through agriculture, cattle raising, and most importantly, long-distance trade. The wealth of Great Zimbabwe came from gold and ivory, which they traded with merchants from as far away as China and Arabia. Archaeologists have found Chinese Ming pottery, Arabic ceramics, and Indian beads at the site, proving that Great Zimbabwe was connected to a vast international trading network. The engineering and architectural skills of the people who built Great Zimbabwe were remarkable. The famous curved wall of the Great Enclosure is over 800 feet long and 32 feet high in some places, built entirely without mortar using a technique that required incredible skill and planning. The builders used over 1 million granite blocks, each carefully shaped and fitted. The kingdom's wealth allowed its rulers to build these magnificent stone structures as symbols of their power and status. The hill complex, built on a rocky outcrop, served as a royal palace and religious center. The great enclosure below may have been used for important ceremonies and as a residence for the royal family. Great Zimbabwe's influence extended far beyond the stone walls. The kingdom controlled gold mines and trade routes throughout the region, making it one of the most powerful states in medieval Africa. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe could afford to import luxury goods from across the Indian Ocean and beyond. But like many great civilizations, Great Zimbabwe eventually declined. By the 15th century, the city was largely abandoned. Historians think this may have been due to the collapse of trade routes, political instability, environmental problems, or a combination of all these factors. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe is so important that when the modern country gained independence in 1980, it chose to name itself Zimbabwe after this remarkable ancient city. Great Zimbabwe proved that Africa had sophisticated civilizations capable of impressive achievements long before European colonization. Karl Mausch's discovery, while based on incorrect assumptions, brought international attention to one of Africa's greatest archaeological treasures. If he had realized the true significance of what he had found, he might have changed how the world viewed African civilizations. The Search for the Real Solomon. While Karl Mauch's African adventure didn't lead to Solomon's mines, it raised an important question. Did King Solomon and his fabulous wealth actually exist? For many years, archaeologists found no evidence outside the Bible that Solomon had ever lived, leading some to conclude that he was just a legendary figure. But in the 1990s, everything changed. Archaeologists working at a site called Tel Dan in northern Israel made an incredible discovery. They found an ancient stone inscription dating to about 850 BC that mentioned the House of David, the first archaeological evidence that King David, Solomon's father, had actually existed. The inscription used the words, "Be it David," which are identical to the Hebrew words for House of David. This discovery proved that David was a real historical figure, not just a character in religious stories. And if he existed, then his son Solomon probably did too. This discovery encouraged archaeologists to look more carefully for evidence of Solomon's kingdom. They began to realize that even if Solomon's reign was smaller and less magnificent than the Bible describes, he might still have been a real king who controlled valuable resources. The key insight came when archaeologists started thinking about what kind of mines Solomon might have actually owned. Everyone had been looking for gold mines, but what if Solomon's wealth came from something else? What if his riches were actually copper mines? During the Bronze Age, copper was incredibly valuable, almost as precious as gold is today. Copper was essential for making tools, weapons, and other important items. A king who controlled copper mines could become extremely wealthy by trading this valuable metal throughout the ancient world. This theory led archaeologists to start looking in a new place, the Arabah Valley, a desert region between Israel and Jordan that is rich in copper deposits. Ancient copper mines had been found there before, but nobody had dated them carefully to see if they might be from Solomon's time. In the early 2000s, archaeologist Thomas Levy began excavating at a site called Khirbat en Nahas in southern Jordan. The name means ruins of copper in Arabic, and Levy's team found evidence of massive copper production. They dug through more than 20 feet of copper slag, waste material left over from smelting copper ore, indicating that metal had been produced there on an industrial scale. But the most exciting discovery was still to come. When Levy's team dated the copper production using radiocarbon dating, they found that the major periods of activity were in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, exactly the time when the Bible says Solomon ruled Israel. "We haven't found Solomon's mines," Levy admitted, "but I think our results put the issue of Solomon's mines, or let's say the Solomonic kingdom and its reach, back on the table." The 2025 breakthrough in Israel's desert. While archaeologists in Jordan were uncovering evidence of ancient copper mining, an even more exciting discovery was taking place in Israel's Timna Valley. This remote desert location had been known for its ancient copper mines since the 1930s.
Timna Valley in Israel is home to an archaeological treasure, copper mines believed to date back to the time of King Solomon.
When American archaeologist Nelson Glueck first explored the area, he suggested it might be connected to King Solomon. For decades, most archaeologists dismissed Glueck's ideas, believing the mines were much older and had nothing to do with Solomon's time. But in 2013, a young Israeli archaeologist named Erez Ben Yosef began a new excavation at a site called Slaves Hill, determined to use modern scientific methods to find out the truth. What Ben Yosef discovered would change everything. In 2025, his team made a breakthrough that finally proved Solomon's gold mines are real, though not in the way anyone expected. The key discovery came from an unlikely source: ancient animal droppings. Ben Yosef's team found 3,000-year-old dung from donkeys and other livestock that had been perfectly preserved by the dry desert climate. At first, they thought it was relatively recent. "We thought maybe some nomads had camped there with their goats a few decades ago," Ben Yosef said, noting that the dung still contained undecayed plant matter. But when radiocarbon dating results came back from the laboratory, they were shocked. The dung was 3,000 years old, dating to the 10th century BC, exactly the time when the Bible says King Solomon ruled Israel. "It was hard to believe," Ben Yosef admitted. This discovery was revolutionary because it proved that the copper mines at Timna were active during Solomon's reign, not hundreds of years earlier as previously thought. But the dung revealed even more secrets. The preserved seeds and pollen showed that the animal's feed had been imported from over 100 miles away, near the Mediterranean coast. This proved that the mining operation was part of a complex, long-distance trading network. Ben Yosef's team also found fortified walls around the mining camp, suggesting they were valuable enough to need military protection. There's a serious possibility that Jerusalem got its wealth from taxing these mining operations, Ben Yosef concluded. The scale of the operation was impressive. More than 1,000 tons of copper smelting debris have been found at Slaves Hill, indicating industrial-scale production worthy of an ancient kingdom. The nearest water source was 12 miles away, and every necessity had to be transported by donkey caravans, making this an incredibly complex and expensive undertaking. Metal in this period was an essential product, similar to the oil of today, Ben Yosef explained. So it was worth these people's while to invest so much in this operation in the middle of the desert. The final revelation. The truth about Solomon's gold mines has finally been revealed in 2025. They weren't gold mines at all, and they weren't exactly Solomon's either. The copper mines at Timnah were operated by a people called the Edomites, who were neighbors, and sometimes enemies, of the ancient Israelites. The Bible mentions several conflicts between King David and the Edomites, and describes how David brought the Edomites to heel. If this is true, then Solomon may have been in a position to demand tribute from the Edomite copper miners. Rather than owning the mines directly, Solomon probably acted like a powerful businessman, controlling trade routes and collecting taxes from the copper that passed through his territory. The Bible describes Solomon as incredibly wise, and this would have been a very smart way to become wealthy, letting others do the dangerous work of mining while collecting a share of the profits. This arrangement would explain how Solomon obtained the metals needed for his famous temple in Jerusalem. The Bible describes the temple as lavishly appointed with gold and bronze objects, which would have required large amounts of metal from industrial-scale mining operations. Solomon likely traded the copper from Timnah's mines for gold and silver from other regions. The discovery proves that the area was home to a complex, sophisticated society during Solomon's time, something that many archaeologists had doubted. Until recently, we had almost nothing from this period in this area, Ben Yosef said. But now we not only know that this was a source of copper, but also that it's from the days of King David and his son Solomon. The preserved textiles, food remains, and other organic materials found at Timnah have provided an unprecedented window into life during the biblical period. These discoveries show that the region supported large-scale industrial operations and long-distance trade networks, exactly the kind of infrastructure that would have been needed to support a wealthy kingdom like Solomon's. Ben Yosef concluded, if King Solomon had mines, they were of copper, and were here at Timnah. The 2025 discoveries have finally solved the 3,000-year-old mystery, proving that while the legends may have gotten some details wrong, the core truth was correct. Solomon's wealth was real, and it came from mines in the desert. What do you think about this amazing discovery? Could there be more biblical treasures waiting to be found in the desert? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.